A structural grid defines locations for elements such as columns and walls. If the grid line is changed, the elements that are referenced to them would also adapt. Levels define building stories and create and control vertical datums. Many elements can be created to start and end on building levels. If the level changes, then referenced elements will also adapt. A scope box can control the visibility and extents of datum elements such as grids, levels, and reference planes. In the example below, two scope boxes are used to control the position and vertical extents of a grid. Note in the project browser that the active plan is level 1. Our first task is to create structural grids from the architect's linked file. To do this, we'll select the structure ribbon and then go ahead and pick the grid button. On the context ribbon, we're going to utilize the pick lines method. I'm going to begin by selecting the grids in sequential order. So this is grid 1, so when I select this, you'll see that Revit then creates a new grid referenced from the architectural grid. I can then proceed through the rest of the sequential grids and let Revit create a new grid based on the architect's grid lines. Here, you'll notice that Revit references this as grid 10. Whilst we're in the grid command, we can simply put a new reference in this case 9A. So we now need to create the multi-segment grids used on grid A, B, and C. To do this, we'll select multi-segment. Again here, we can utilize the pick lines, and we can then pick the two lines representing grid A. Once I've selected those, I can select the Finish Edit mode. And again, it's important then to rename the grid. I'll then right mouse and repeat the grid command, select multi-segment, and then select pick lines. Finish the edit mode, and note that this is now taken on the next grid, grid B. Let's repeat that whole process for grid C. We can then create the last three grids by clicking grid, and again by going directly to pick lines and picking off the last three elements. Our grids are now created. To enable us to see these better, we can go to Visibility Graphics and switch off the linked model. On the View ribbon, select Visibility Graphics. On the Revit Links tab, uncheck the Architect's model. Here are our structural grids. Once these grids are created, it's recommended that the grids are pinned in case you accidentally reposition these. So we can window select all of the grids and select Pin. Note that the arrangement of grids looks quite untidy. The reason for this is some grid heads are displaying on end 1 and others are displaying on end 2. We're going to edit the family type of the grid and consolidate this. So select one of the grids, and you can note here that all the grids are using this family type 1/4 inch bubble. Let's go ahead and click Edit Type. In the Type Properties dialog box, you'll note here that we have our symbol used for our grid. But also here, you can see that we have two options, the Plan View Symbols End 1 and Plan View Symbols End 2. I'm going to ensure that both of these options are checked, and then click OK. So now note that the arrangement of the grids looks much nicer. We also need to suppress the two grid bubbles on grid F, so I'll go ahead and select both of these, and here's the arrangement that we were looking for. We can do a very similar thing with the levels. So in our project browser, let's switch to the south elevation. On the right hand side here, you can see that we have our levels currently being shown. All of the symbols are on the left hand side. What I'd like to do is edit these so the symbols only appear on the right hand side. So we can select one of our levels. Again, in the Properties palette, we can click Edit Type. And again, note here that we have symbol at end 1 or symbol at end 2. We'll ensure that symbol at end 1 is checked and symbol at end 2 is unchecked. And here are our levels updated. Next, you generate structural plans from the levels we've just created. On the View ribbon, under the Plan Views drop-down, select Structural Plan. Select all the levels in the list and click OK. Revit has now generated all of the plans. We now create a scope box to control the grids on the right-hand side of the structure. On the View ribbon, select Scope Box. We're going to create a scope box, just roughly about this size here. This is an arbitrary dimension. What's important now though is I rotate the scope box to match the rotation of my building structure. You'll notice here that we have a rotate tool built into the scope box, but this won't allow us to accurately define the rotation. So instead, we're going to use the rotate command. We'll place the center of rotation on our grid. And here I can pick a straight horizontal line and then snap the scope box to the same rotation as our grid. We can then use the shape handles on the scope box to fine-tune the overall size. In the Properties palette, you'll note that we can give the scope box a name. So I'm going to call this one Wing B. And I can then select the grids that I'd like to control with this scope box. Once I have the grid selected, note here I can select the particular scope box that we'd like to use, in this case Wing B. So you'll now notice that grids have updated to that scope box. You may want to change the vertical extents of our scope box. We can select the scope box, and in the Properties palette, under View Visible, we can select Edit. Note here that in the 3D view, I could override the visibility and set this as visible. And I'll do the same in the south elevation. If we now take a look at the south elevation, you'll now note that my scope box is visible, and once again I can use the shape handles to control the extents of my scope box. If I wanted to here, again I could select my levels and I could assign those to the same scope box. Note in 3D we also see the scope box.